I'm taking his inheritance. If you don't like it, let's get a divorce.
The reason I cried during the funeral and put on that fake show in front of my mom and my sister Emily was to make them believe that I was mentally ill and just making up lies to avoid divorcing Greg. By acting innocent, he planned to say it was my illness that caused the divorce, and that way he wouldn't have to pay alimony. But I saw through Greg's shallow scheme and simply accepted the divorce papers. I'm not the only one inheriting. There's no way I'm giving the money my beloved dad left to someone like you. I packed my things, pretending to be shocked as much as possible. I'll submit the divorce papers after I sign them. Even when I said that, Greg smirked at me.
You better submit them properly, okay? Just because you don't want to get divorced doesn't mean you can sweep this under the rug.
I left the house with Greg's words echoing behind me. As promised, I headed straight to the courthouse to submit the divorce papers. There was no way I was going to hide them. After watching them get officially accepted, I walked to one more place. My name is Catherine. I'm 47 years old and married. Although I have a husband, we don't have any children, so at this age, our relationship has naturally grown distant. I met Greg over 20 years ago. At the time, I had just graduated from college and was working at a local bank. My parents were strict and pushed me to find stable jobs, so I ended up working at the bank, though I had no real interest in it. I wasn't looking to stir up trouble with my family, so I reluctantly passed the bank's entrance exam and started working there. Before I knew it, a few years had passed without any clear career vision or goals. That's when I met Greg, my current husband. He was 5 years older than me, already in his 30s when we met. Nowadays, a 5-year age difference doesn't seem like much at all. But back then, 5 years felt like a big deal. Greg, running his own company at a young age, seemed very mature to me. I've always been shy and haven't had much experience in romance. But this time, I was sure of it. I was falling for Greg. Apparently, he had just taken over his parents' company, and I gradually realized he was a valued client at the bank. Of course, I wasn't assigned to such a big client just a few years into my career. As a quiet observer, I secretly enjoyed watching Greg visit the bank once a month. But then, the opportunity came out of nowhere. The senior colleague who was in charge of Greg suddenly got sick and took the day off, so I was asked to fill in since I happened to have some free time. Hello. I robotically made my way to Greg, who was seated in a back office. I must have looked so strange that Greg found me amusing.
You're a funny one, aren't you? You don't need to be so nervous. I'm not gonna bite.
He probably used to dealing with women. Thanks to Greg, I loosened up, and we had a natural conversation. That moment led to us dating. Despite the 5-year age gap, I hardly felt it once we started going out. Greg's mindset was still youthful, and we got along as equals. About a year later, Greg proposed to me. I hadn't told my parents yet, but Greg was respected enough to be trusted by the bank as a company president. I accepted Greg's proposal, confident that my parents would approve of him right away. However, married life went in a completely different direction than I had imagined.
What were you thinking? Not even consulting with us.
After Greg visited my parents' home, my dad quietly started speaking. Since my dad is usually a man of few words, and he didn't directly complain to Greg, I assumed he was happy about my marriage. But I was wrong.
You can't trust that man. If you want to back out, Now's the time. I'm not going to complain about your decision, but I'm telling you this.
After Greg left, my dad's words shocked my mom too.
Come on, dear. You don't have to say it like that just because you're feeling lonely. He seems like such a decent man, and his family is well established, right?
My mom tried to smooth things over, but my dad went silent after that. That night, I went to bed with a strange, unsettled feeling. The next morning, my dad added, "Just promise me you'll keep this in mind." What he asked wasn't anything unreasonable, so I agreed without hesitation. Given his position, I figured he had his worries. From then until I moved out to live with Greg, my dad didn't say another word about him. He acted like everything was normal, but the fact that we never talked about Greg again is something I've always regretted. When our newlywed life began, I became a full-time housewife to support Greg. As the president of his company, Greg was always busy with meetings and travel, so he was often away from home. At first, I wasn't bothered by this since I knew stories of couples who lived apart or dealt with long work trips right after getting married. Even though I spent a lot of time alone and felt lonely, I was happy for the first year of our marriage. Or rather, it would be more accurate to say I was happy for about a year. As time went on, Greg's true nature started to reveal itself. I wanted to scream at the me who had admired and thought Greg was so cool. In the early days of dating and marriage, I convinced myself that there was no way Greg could act like this, turning a blind eye to his behavior. But it became too obvious to ignore.
I've been working all day, so at least have dinner ready when I get home. Isn't it a wife's job to have a meal prepared, even without a heads up?
Greg often ate out when he worked late, but when he occasionally came home early, he'd start with lectures like this. That was just the beginning. He began criticizing the way I spoke, my clothes, and everything. When I casually talked to my friends about it, the answer I got was simple: divorce. No matter who I asked, everyone agreed Greg's behavior was abnormal. He was a typical, out-of-touch, terrible husband. The man who was once my proud, older boyfriend had become someone my friends labeled as such. Even though I knew something was wrong, I couldn't find a concrete solution. The word divorce crossed my mind many times, but making that decision wasn't easy. In less than 2 years of marriage, I began to feel afraid of Greg, who would constantly criticize me whenever we were together. Sensing my fear, Greg only escalated his behavior. Even though he knew I was aware of it, he continued cheating on me. When I first found out about his affairs, I confronted him. But he quickly turned the blame on me, claiming it was my fault.
It's your fault for not being attractive in the first place. Instead of blaming me all the time, maybe you should reflect on yourself a bit.
I had never felt more shocked in my life than I did at those words, and I ended up vomiting everything in my stomach. Instead of comforting me when I was that devastated, Greg continued to mock me and repeated his affairs. I withdrew further into myself, and after about 10 years of marriage, I finally developed a mental illness. It was the result of years and years of accumulated stress. Even so, I still managed the bare minimum of household chores so Greg wouldn't get mad, just trying to get through each day. I wondered if going to the hospital might make me feel a little better. I kept telling and deceiving myself as time went on. But Greg's bad habits never stopped. We still maintained minimal communication, but one day, I got a call from my younger sister, Emily, for the first time in a while.
Hey, Catherine, you haven't talked to me lately. But Greg hasn't been doing something awful again, has he?
I was embarrassed to tell my family about Greg's many outrageous acts, but I had been confiding in Emily about his humiliating behavior for some time. I couldn't bring myself to tell my dad, who had already seen through Greg's two-faced nature, but Emily always listened to me with empathy. However, since I'd become mentally drained, I'd found it hard to stay in touch, even casually, so I hadn't updated her on my current situation. I'm sorry, I've been distant and cold to you recently, Emily, but I think I'm reaching my limit. I confess Greg's cheating and verbal abuse to her over the phone, crying as I spoke. I wasn't sure if I even managed to get the whole story out. The more I spoke, the more the pain and frustration welled up.
Sis, you don't have to keep pushing yourself like this. Dad wouldn't be mad at you. It's okay to think about getting a divorce.
Emily spoke to me gently, but with strength in her voice. After that, Emily took me to the hospital, where I was diagnosed with depression. The doctor explained that I needed to distance myself from the source of my stress immediately. If I could do that so easily, I wouldn't be in this situation. While that thought crossed my mind, I took the doctor's advice to heart. I was prescribed medication that day, and for the first time in a while, I felt a little relief. All of this was thanks to Emily.
I'd love to stay with you, but I know that's not what you want right now. But you remember, if he ever does anything, I'll make sure he pays.
Emily tried to keep things light and treated me the same as she always had, even though I knew she was worried about me. She brought a bit of hope into my heart, which had been isolated for so long, and I was truly grateful to her. Emily continued to stay in touch frequently and visited me often. Thanks to the medication I got from the hospital, I was able to sleep better. Compared to before the hospital, I had more moments of mental calm and even started reconnecting with friends. I hadn't told Greg about my depression, fearing the cutting remarks he might make. But there were still times when I would suddenly break down crying or become paralyzed by it all. Greg, however, remained completely indifferent, spending his days out and about, never once showing any concern for me. Knowing he was cheating, I found myself relieved when he wasn't at home. I had no idea what I wanted for myself going forward. I spent every day grappling with these contradictions, barely holding on. And in the middle of these endless days, tragedy struck. It was about 10 years after I had developed depression. My dad suddenly collapsed and passed away without ever regaining consciousness. When I was informed of my dad's condition, I felt myself sinking into a deep darkness again. If something happened to the man who had always been there for me, what would I do? I felt disgusted with myself for worrying about my own problems while my dad was in such a dire state. At first, I got a panicked phone call from my mom, but a few minutes later, she called again, her voice calm. I couldn't even ask for the location of the hospital, and the phone wasn't going through. By the time I managed to get through, it was too late.
Your dad has passed away.
Emily didn't make it in time either, and it was only my mom who was with him in his final moments. My dad had never had any major health issues before. But perhaps due to his age, he couldn't survive the sudden heart attack. When I had seen him just a short while ago, there was no sign that anything was wrong. I found myself lost in thought, trying to remember what his face looked like the last time I saw him.
Are you okay?
My mom asked, peering into my face with concern. It seemed that Emily hadn't told her about my recent struggles, but after a few days of watching my behavior since my dad's death, She must have sensed something was wrong. I didn't know how long I had been deep in thought, but her concern seemed to increase with each passing moment. I'm okay. I knew this day would come eventually, and I've got Emily here with me. Lately, I had been so overwhelmed mentally that I couldn't think beyond myself. But thinking about Emily and my mom, I suddenly felt a surge of warmth in my chest, realizing that I needed to step up and be there for them. With that thought, returning to the house where Greg was waiting no longer scared me. For so long, I had only endured, but now the time had come to make a big decision. Even though our marriage had grown cold, Greg still attended my dad's funeral. It was surprising to see him, after not having seen my mom in years, shedding tears as he greeted her. But with the family needing to talk things over, I had already sent Greg home. I had suspected Greg's scheme all along, and as expected, the fake tears and dramatic act he put on in front of my family vanished the moment he got home.
I'm taking his inheritance. If you don't like it, let's get a divorce.
Even though he had lived apart from my dad, Greg clearly had never been comfortable around him. I had gone along with whatever Greg wanted without saying a word, but deep down, he was always afraid of my dad. That's why he couldn't just go ahead with the divorce and live with his mistress. His phony act in front of my mom and Emily was meant to make them believe that my mental illness was causing me to lie, and that I didn't want to divorce Greg. By making himself look good, he was planning to blame the divorce on my illness so he wouldn't have to pay alimony. I saw through Greg's shallow scheme and accepted the divorce papers without a fuss. I'm not the only one inheriting the estate. There's no way I'm giving the money my beloved dad left to someone like you. Feigning shock, I rushed into my room. I packed my things quickly and started preparing to leave the house. Once I was ready, I put on the most heartbroken face I could manage and stood in front of Greg. I'll submit the divorce papers after I sign them. Greg looked at me with a smirk.
Make sure you do, okay? Just because you don't want to get divorced doesn't mean you can sweep this under the rug.
With his words echoing behind me, I left the house. As promised, I headed straight to the courthouse to submit the divorce papers. Who was going to sweep anything under the rug? After watching the papers get accepted, I made my way to another destination. When I arrived and identified myself at the reception, the clerk seemed flustered. Within seconds, a man came rushing over to me.
My apologies for the delay. We weren't expecting you, so nothing has been prepared.
Cutting off the man's panicked excuses, I spoke. I'm terminating all contracts. The man was stunned for a while by these words. The shock must have been too much for him to process.
Well, what exactly do you mean by that?
It wasn't surprising that he was so confused. This man had done nothing wrong and was clearly blindsided by the situation. I knew he was aware that I was the chairperson of the 12 companies responsible for nearly all of their revenue, but he wasn't the one in charge of the company. He was just another executive. The real person in charge of the company was Greg. Yes, the man who had been my husband until just a little while ago. The atmosphere in the company quickly became tense, and soon there was a flurry of activity. Of course, Greg was contacted, and I was informed that he was on his way here. He still didn't know that I was the chairperson of the company he had been working with for years. There was no way Greg could have known. After all, I had never told him that my dad was the founder of a famous national conglomerate. Before I got married, my dad had asked me to keep this a secret. When I got engaged to Greg, my dad was already at the helm of the group of 12 companies. But at the time, I hadn't told Greg anything about it. On the day my dad first met Greg, he had seen right through Greg's two-faced nature and asked me to keep my family status a secret. From my own experiences, I had learned that people could be drawn to wealth, so I understood why my dad was worried. It was no surprise that my dad was worried, since many people had approached me in the past for similar reasons. With that in mind, I followed his instructions. And the more I got to know Greg, the more I realized his advice had been right. Who knows what would have happened if I had told Greg about my dad from the beginning? It was about 5 years ago that my dad, due to his age, handed over the chairperson role to me. Since then, I've been running the company with the help of Emily. Being more social than I am, Emily took on the public role as the face of the company, while I managed things behind the scenes. When I took over the company, I discovered that one of our group's companies had a close relationship with Greg's. Since I was always in the background, Greg had no way of knowing this. At that time, I had no intention of mixing business with my personal life. But things are different now. Continuing to deal with a company run by such a despicable man can only lead to trouble in the future. This, combined with a sense of moral duty, is what led me to make the big decision to divorce.
What the hell is going on?
Greg burst into the company, dressed oddly in fancy clothes. Why was he trying to look good in the middle of such a crisis? Seeing Greg unaware of my presence made me inwardly smirk. Just a few seconds later, a young woman came rushing in after him.
What's going on? What's this about?
The woman, dressed in flashy, revealing clothes, looked like she was barely in her 20s. Apparently, this was Greg's mistress, a girl named Eileen. What could a man over 50 possibly be thinking, dating someone so young? Does he seriously believe he's worthy of a girl her age? I couldn't help but feel ashamed of Greg's arrogance after living with him for so long.
Hey, who screwed up and caused all our deals to get canceled?
Ignoring Eileen, Greg shouted at the entire floor. Even though the failure was his own, he was clueless about taking responsibility. Looking at the employees' faces, it was clear that Greg was disliked. Everyone stared at him with disdain in their eyes. He'd probably been parading Eileen around the office, doing whatever he pleased. Cough. I cleared my throat loudly to catch Greg's attention. The sound echoed through the silent office, and Greg finally looked in my direction. Greg did a double take, his dumbfounded expression utterly foolish.
What are you doing here?
Do you even know who you're talking to? Because of your incompetence, the company's entire dealings have been canceled. Shouldn't your first action be an apology? Greg tilted his head and clicked his tongue in irritation. The man who had been with me earlier leaned in to whisper something in Greg's ear.
What are you talking about? I knew you'd lost it. This woman used to be my wife just a little while ago.
Greg yelled, pointing at me as he ranted to the employees. But their expressions hadn't changed. None of them doubted me. Well, whatever, I was willing to reconsider if you had apologized immediately and made amends for your past behavior. But I'm sorry to say that because of this man, the company will most likely go bankrupt. Judging by what I see here, it looks like many of you have been mistreated for a long time. I strongly recommend that you all take this opportunity to sue Greg. Several employees nodded desperately at my words. They must have been treated horribly all this time. Greg finally seemed to realize that what I was saying was the undeniable truth. You've left everything to your employees while indulging in your affairs. That's why this is happening. If you'd been doing your jobs properly, you might have figured out that my sister Emily and I were involved. I threw my words at Greg with all the sarcasm I could muster.
What apology? Who do you think has been keeping you afloat this whole time?
Greg finally snapped, turning on me. Once he started making nonsensical excuses, it was clear his downfall was near. He was no better than a disgruntled customer who enjoyed complaining. Bringing Greg's company to bankruptcy would be easy, almost too simple. But this level of revenge wouldn't erase the countless humiliations I'd suffered. To take everything from Greg, I set my sights on the next target. It was Greg's mistress, Eileen. I'm the chairperson of the group of 12 companies, by the way. And who's been keeping who afloat? Did everyone hear that? As you can see, this man is a ridiculously outdated, self-centered fool. I continued to provoke Greg while eyeing Eileen. No matter how angry I made him, there was nothing he could do. From my experience living with him, I knew this for sure. There's no way this man would have the guts to do anything with all these people watching. Eileen, hearing my words, started to look unsettled. She was clearly having second thoughts. Even though we had just met, I could tell right away. It was insane for anyone to be involved with a man like this. She either had a hidden weakness, was incredibly naive, or was planning to use Greg herself.
Everyone, get back to work. Ignore this woman and listen to me.
Greg tried to assert himself, but no one paid attention.
Well, is the company really going to go under?
At that moment, an out-of-place voice filled the room. Eileen had finally spoken. Greg was startled and glared at her.
Stop saying stupid things and go home. I'll take care of everything from now on, so just wait for me there.
Greg ordered her, but Eileen kept tilting her head in confusion. She must have been questioning Greg for some time now. How old are you? I read her thoughts and threw the question at her.
I'm 23.
She had clearly figured out by now that I was Greg's ex-wife. She probably hadn't expected me to speak to her directly. Did you know he was married? I continued without missing a beat.
I only found out recently. A few years ago, I was buried in debt because of my obsession with host clubs, and Greg helped me out. That's how we started dating, but I was stupid and completely fooled.
So that's what happened. He'd made her indebted to him, then kept her around by deceiving her. What a scumbag. If ever there was a moment that made your skin crawl, this was it. Do you love Greg, or did you? Eileen hesitated for a moment, but she looked me in the eyes and answered firmly.
At first, I thought he was kind for helping me, and I think I really did love him. But over time, I started to feel unsure. It's like he's been manipulating me.
She was much more aware than I had anticipated. She had genuinely fallen for Greg's kindness and was probably serious about their relationship. I was deceived by this man, and he ruined my life. Haven't you already repaid the kindness he showed you? Besides, he lied to you and used you. It's not too late. Wake up. I delivered the final blow to Eileen's hesitation. Even if it wasn't with her, Greg had definitely been involved with other women. Strangely, I felt my anger toward Eileen fade. What started as a plan to use her for revenge had now turned into genuine sympathy for her.
Shut up. Stop running your mouth. You are just bitter and can't handle it.
Greg, noticing Eileen's uncertainty, desperately lashed out. Bitter? You think too highly of yourself. I'm just telling her the truth. Who would feel bad about leaving a broke, middle-aged man with no money or company? I continued to tear Greg down, humiliating him in front of his employees.
What do you mean running my mouth? You hid the fact that you were married. You've probably been messing around with other women too, right? Well, that's over now. No one's going to want some broke, creepy old guy.
It seemed Eileen had made up her mind to leave Greg. My words had woken her up. Greg's dream of divorcing me and marrying a younger woman had crumbled. On top of that, he was about to lose both his company and his money. Creepy old guy, have you finally woken up? Let me tell you about the reality you're about to face. At my words, Greg swallowed hard. His eyes were bloodshot, and cold sweat was breaking out all over his face. As I said, all deals with this company are terminated, and with the evidence I have of your insults and affairs, I'll be suing you. You know how much that's going to cost, don't you? And don't forget, the company going bankrupt will be entirely your fault. The employees will probably sue too. I delivered the final blow to Greg, like knocking over the first domino in a line. One by one, the dominoes collapsed, destroying Greg's mental state right before my eyes.
No, this is a joke.
Greg, a middle-aged man now crying and screaming, disgusted everyone in the room. It was all his fault, and there was no undoing it. Tears, snot, and drool dripped from Greg as he collapsed on the floor, wailing incoherently. It was over. I apologized sincerely to the man who had helped me earlier and informed him of the next steps. Everyone had seen this coming, but none of the employees blamed me. You shouldn't be fooled by someone like that anymore. If you live your life honestly, you'll find someone who loves you for who you really are. I offered these final words to Eileen, who stood over Greg in silent disbelief. Eileen bowed her head to me in silence and left the company. I followed her out, leaving Greg's company behind. Once outside, I pulled out my phone from my pocket and let out a deep sigh. Well, Emily's probably going to be mad at me for deciding everything on my own. Having lived with Greg up until now, I headed back to my family's house without saying a word. I'm home. Mom? Emily? Peeking into the house cautiously, I heard footsteps running down the hallway.
Catherine, what happened?
It seemed that the commotion had already reached Emily, my co-manager. Honestly, it was now her job to run around and deal with the fallout. Emily, I'm so sorry. I interrupted Emily and apologized.
I've got a good idea of what happened, but for now, just come inside, okay?
She looked more exasperated than angry, which was a relief. Feeling the weight lift from my chest, I followed her into the house. Once inside, I sat down with Emily and Mom and explained everything that had happened. By canceling our company's dealings with Greg's firm, I knew I had sent a ripple of panic through the business. As I talked to them, I became more and more calm, fully realizing just what I had done.
I never thought you'd do something so bold, Catherine.
I knew neither of them intended to blame me. But Emily and Mom's words still stung, pricking at my heart. I deeply regretted my impulsive actions. Of course, I'll be handling things publicly as well. A few days later, as expected, Greg's company completely fell apart and went bankrupt. I sued him for alimony as planned. During the trial, Greg found out that not only was I suing him, but Eileen and the employees were as well. Losing his company, his assets, and his girlfriend all at once seemed to push Greg over the edge. He had destroyed the business he inherited from his parents through his own actions. It was the ultimate act of betrayal to his family. On top of that, he had spiraled into a deep depression, once again becoming a burden to his parents. I was relieved that Eileen had finally come to her senses, but no one would want anything to do with this hopeless middle-aged man now. What awaited Greg was a future of deep despair and loneliness. I didn't feel the slightest bit of sympathy for him. After all the lives he had wrecked, he deserved to suffer for the rest of his days. Not long after Greg's company went under, I gathered the employees and helped them transition to other positions within our group of companies. I couldn't leave them stranded after they lost their jobs because of the mess Greg and I had created. As Emily and I worked together to clean up the aftermath, I found my own mental state improving as well. Ironically, the business saved me. Without the constant stress Greg had caused me, it felt like the weight had lifted and the world around me brightened. All the worries that had consumed me seemed ridiculous now, and I found myself truly grateful to be alive. I had wasted so much time with that man, but there was still plenty of time to start over. I probably wouldn't be interested in dating for a while, but one thing was certain. It was that my new beginning would be full of hope.